The Little Princess of Tower Hill, Chapter 7. In Violet. Maggie and Ralph spent a very happy afternoon at the zoo. The best of Ralph always came to the surface when he was with his mother, and he was also impressed by Joe's remarks about her rabbits. Was it really true that Maggie had done a beautiful deed by giving his white and pretty darlings their liberty in the country wood? How Joe's eyes shone when she spoke, and how ecstatically she looked at the little princess. Ralph was a great deal too much of a boy and a great deal too proud to make any set speech of forgiveness to Maggie, but he determined on the spot to restore her to his favor. He ceased to be condescending and greeted her more as a little hail and farewell met. Maggie rejoiced in the change. Mrs. Granville was her brightest and most agreeable self. The lions on near acquaintance proved more fascinating than dreadful, and on their way home Maggie pronounced in favor of the zoo, said she would certainly like to go there again, and thought that, on the whole, it must be a nicer place than Madame Tussaud's, where, according to Ralph's account, unless you visited the Chamber of Horrors there, were only large and overgrown dolls to be seen. "I wonder," said Maggie to her cousin, as they sat in the most amiable manner side by side at their tea that evening, "I wonder why Susie cares to go out into the streets and sing and play a funny little tambourine. She can't be at all shy to sing before a lot of people, can she, Ralph?" Ralph stared hard at Maggie. "Don't you really know what she does it for?" he asked. "I suppose for a kind of play," said Maggie, opening her eyes a little. Ralph stamped his foot impatiently. "A kind of play," he repeated. "I was beginning to respect you. I forgot how ignorant you are. Poor Susie goes out and plays the tambourine and dances and sings because she wants pennies. Pennies to buy bread for Joe and for herself and for Ben and Bob. No, of course you can't know. Susie wants the tambourine not to play with, but because she's hungry." Ralph spoke with great energy. Maggie's little round face became quite pale. She dropped the delicious bread and butter and marmalade which she was putting to her lips, and remained absolutely silent. "Must the tambourine cost half a crown?" she asked presently. "Yes," replied Ralph. "Didn't you hear her say so? She knows best what it costs." Maggie wished she were not such a dunce, that she could read a little and write a little, and that she had some slight knowledge of figures. Hitherto she had been shy of revealing any of her great ignorance to Ralph, but now her intense longing to know how many pennies were in a half a crown made her ask her cousin the question. Ralph assured her carelessly that there were 30 pennies in that very substantial piece of money. "It will take a long time to collect," he said, slightly sighing deeply. "Poor Susie will have plenty of patience, for I know Joe can't help her, and she'll have to depend on me. I earn a penny a day when I'm good. I generally am good when I'm with Mother, and it was quite different at Tower Hill, for you annoyed me a good deal, Maggie. But I've made up my mind to say nothing more on the subject. I dare say you, too, will try to be good, girl, when you're with your mother. Well, what was I saying? Oh, about Susie's pennies. With what I gave her and what Joe collected, she has got 14. Take 14 from 30. How much is left, Maggie? Of course you know, so I need not tell you. All that number of days poor Susie will have to wait, however hungry she is. There we have finished our tea. Let's go up to the drawing-room to Mother now. Isn't Mother sweet? Did you ever see anyone so nice?" "Yes, I saw my own mother, and she's a lot nicer," said Maggie. Ralph's eyes flashed. "I like that," he said. "Why, every one says the same thing about their own mother, that she's the very, very nicest lady in the world. Oh, I say, Maggie, where are you?" But his little cousin had disappeared. The facts were these. The events of her first day in London had worked up poor little Maggie's feelings to a crisis. She had been excited, she had been pleased, she had been greatly surprised, all the old tranquil life in the midst of which she had moved, knowing all the time that she was its center, that she, the little princess, was the beloved object for whom most things were done, for whom treats were prepared and delights got ready. All this old life had vanished, and Maggie was nothing more than little Maggie Ascot, an ignorant child, a dunce, who could not even reckon figures or read a word of the Queen's English, or have any pennies in her own purse. Maggie was only the little cousin whom Ralph rather despised, who was nobody at all in his estimation compared to Joe, who was so humble, so very poor. Maggie's feelings had been greatly moved about Joe and Susie. She had longed beyond words to put the necessary number of pennies into Susie's hand, and to tell her to go out and buy the tambourine, on which her heart was set, without a moment's delay. She had wished this when she only supposed that Susie wanted the tambourine to amuse herself. How much more now did she long to get it for her, when Ralph had assured her that Susie's needs were so great that she wished for the tambourine in order that she might earn money to buy bread. When Ralph said this, Maggie felt a lump rising in her throat, and her own healthy childish appetite failing her. Even then she felt inclined to rush away and cry. But when Ralph added to this his somewhat slighting remark about the mother whose arms Maggie did so long to feel round her, the little princess could bear her feelings no longer, and rushed downstairs to sob out her full heart. It was not Miss Grey who found Maggie in the dark in her little room, but the good-natured Waters, who after all knew far more about children than the somewhat inexperienced governess. Waters wasted no time in asking the little girl what was the matter, but she lifted her into a very motherly embrace, and smoothed and petted her with many loving words. Maggie thought Waters a most wonderful person, and soon wiped away her tears and began to smile once again. Waters was judicious enough to ask no questions about the tears, and when they were over to forget that they ever existed. She took Maggie into her mistress's room, and made her sit in the bed, and showed her some of Ralph's childish toys. It occurred to Maggie as she sat there that Waters would not be nearly such a dreadful person as most others to confide in. She was intensely anxious to gain some information, and she resolved to trust Waters. "May I tell you something? A great, tremendous secret?" she asked. "Well, Miss Maggie, that's as you please," replied the servant. "I can only tell you one thing. That's what confided to me is a secret from the day forward, and no mistake. What's the color to keep a secret in, Miss Maggie? In violet. That's where I keeps it, and so it's sure to be safe." Maggie laughed and clapped her hands. "Waters, I think you're a darling," she said, "and I will trust you. I don't suppose you ever heard of anyone so ignorant as me. I'll be 8 years old before very long, and I can't read, and I can't write, and I can't put figures together, and I can't even tell the time, Waters. I can't really." While Maggie was speaking, Waters kept gazing at her with a most perfectly unmoved countenance. "Bless the child," she said presently. "Well, Miss Maggie dear, where's the secret I'm to keep in violet?" "Why, that's it, Waters. The secret is that I don't know nothing at all." "Well, you'll learn, dearie," said Waters. "You'll learn all in good time. You're nothing but a little child, and you has lots and lots of years before you." Maggie did not at all consider herself very young. There were 1 or 2 babies in the village at home, just beginning to toddle, who were really juvenile. But she, Maggie Ascot, who could run and jump and skip and even ride, it was really rather silly to speak of her as a very young child. However, now she was so soothed by Waters' gentle words, and Waters' patting that she could find no fault with any remark made to her by the worthy woman. On the contrary, she cuddled up to her and stroked her cheek, and felt relieved at the unburdening of her secret. "I didn't learn to read till I was a good bit older than you," said Waters. "I don't mean that I am an example for any dear little lady to follow, for I never could abide a bookworm. I don't take it now. I only learned because my mother said it was a shame to have a great big girl who could neither spell nor write. My tastes always lay in the needlework line, since I was a little tot. I was forever with a bit of sewing in my hand. I'd hem and I'd backstitch and I'd top sew whenever I had the chance. Why, mind me of the time when I unpicked one of my father's old shirts just for the pleasure of putting it together again, and didn't mother laugh when she saw what I was after? Plain needlework was my line, Miss Maggie, and maybe it's yours too, dearie." "Oh, no, it isn't," said Maggie, opening her blue eyes with quite a gleam of horror in them. "I hate plain sewing, worser even than I hate reading. I hate it even worser than my figures. Plain sewing pricks, and it worries me. I hate it more than anything." "Well, well, dearie, you're in the pricking stage yet. I went through that same as another. You'll come to learn comfort in it, for all the soothers for poor worried people were nothing at all, in my opinion, like needle and thread." Maggie was beginning to find this turn in the conversation rather unintelligible, so she brought Waters back to the subject which was interesting to her, by asking if she had also found the study of figures very hard for the worries, and if she would let her know how many pennies Susie must have to make up the half-crown. "Oh, is that little Susie?" said Waters. "I don't approve of no child going out to sing in the streets. However, it isn't for me to interfere with Mrs. Aylmer. She is an honest and hard-working body as ever walked, and that little Joe is a real angel. As the poor thing must live somewhere, why, I suppose Susie had better sing. Master Ralph is saving up his pennies, and he'll give them all to her as soon as sure. So you have no call to put yourself out about it, Miss Maggie." "Yes, but I don't want her to wait," said Maggie. "She has nothing to eat, and she'll be so dreadfully, dreadfully hungry. She has got 14 pennies, and she can't get anything to eat until she has 30. Oh, Waters, if you do know figures, please tell me how many days poor Susie must live without any food until she has got the 30 pennies." Waters laughed. "Things won't be as bad as that for Susie," she said. "She's a sturdy little piece, and I don't believe she denies herself much. Don't you fret about her, Miss Maggie dearie." "Yes, but what is the difference between 14 and 30? insisted Maggie. "Ralph only gets a penny a day. How many days will they have to wait?" "She has 14 now," said Waters. Well, it is something of a poser. I never had much aptitude in figure line, Miss Maggie. 14 in hand, 30 to make up. Well, let's try it by our fingers. 10 fingers first. 5 on each hand. Bear that in your mind, Miss Maggie. Add 10 to 14. Makes 24. Come now. I'll get on. But that isn't 30, is it, darling? Try the fingers again. 5 more fingers makes 29. And 1, why, there you are, 30. 10, 5, and 1 makes 16. There, Miss Maggie, 16 pennies more she'll have to get. Just at this moment, Mrs. Grenville entered the room, and Maggie's conversation with the good-natured lady's maid was brought to an abrupt conclusion. The next morning Maggie awoke out of a profound sleep, in which she had been dreaming of Joe as turned into a real angel with wings, of Susie as playing on the most perfect tambourine that was ever invented, and the little girl awoke out of this slumber to hear the unfamiliar London sounds and to sit up in bed and rub her sleepy eyes. The hours kept at Mrs. Grenville's were not so early as those enjoyed in Tower Hill. Maggie was tired of laying in bed, so she occupied a tiny room which led out of Miss Gray's, and she now jumped up and went to the window. What was her amazement to see just under the window, walking leisurely across the road, one of the objects of her last vivid dream. Susie herself. Susie's very stout little form was seen crossing the street and coming right up to the Greenvilles' house. Maggie was charmed to see her, and took not an instant in making up her mind to improve the occasion. She knocked violently on the pane, but her room was too high up for even Susie's quick ears to discern this signal, and she then, in her little blue dressing-gown, rushed through Miss Gray's room and ran out as fast as her small feet would carry her down the stairs, down and down, until she reached the front hall. There was no servant in the hall, but the chain had already been taken off the hall door, and Maggie had no difficulty in slipping back the bolt. She opened the door and stood on the steps. "Susie! Susie! Susie!" she screamed. Susie at this moment was receiving what indeed she came for every morning, a good supply of broken bread and meat from Mrs. Grenville's cook. Mrs. Grenville allowed the cook to give them things to Mrs. Aylmer, and Susie was generally sent to fetch them. She was much amazed to see the pretty little country girl calling to her so vehemently. She was also delighted, and came to the foot of the hall door steps, and looked up at Maggie with a very eager face. For a girl who was so dreadfully starved, Maggie could not help thinking the said face rather round and full. However, she would not allow this passing reflection to spoil her interest. She beckoned to Susie, and said in a whisper, "I'm most terribly sorry for you. If I had any money I'd give it to you, really and truly I would. But I haven't got nothing at all. Father has. Father's ever so rich. And he's not with me. He's far away, and I can't. Oh, Susie, can you write?" Maggie stood in a contemplative attitude. Susie poised herself on one leg, held her basket of broken meat in a careless manner, as though it did not account for anything at all, and kept her quick and intelligent eyes fixed on the little princess. "I do want to help you very much," said Maggie at last. "I want to help you my own self, without anyone knowing anything about it. I think I want to do this as much for Joe as for you. Once I didn't like Joe at all, but now I do love her. She looks so beautiful and so sweet. I don't think you do. You have rather a cross face, and you're very red. You've such fat cheeks, but maybe being hungry makes people look cross and red." And fat?" continued Susie eagerly. "I'm puffed out with being so hollow inside. I am now, missy, really. It's an awfully empty feeling, and it won't go, not a bit of it, till I gets that 'ere tambourine." "I wish I could help you," continued Maggie again. Just then there were sounds inside the house, sounds of dustpans and brushes, and of industrious maids approaching, and Susie knew that her opportunity was short. "I believe you, missy," she said. "I believe in your kind heart, missy. It do seem a shame as you shouldn't have no money, for you would know how to provide for the poor and needy, missy. But it might be managed in other ways, Miss Maggie." "In other ways?" repeated Maggie. "How, Susie? How?" "Why, now you hasn't nothing as you could sell, I suppose." "That I could sell?" repeated Miss Ascot. "Oh dear, no. I haven't anything at all to make a shop with, if that's what you mean." "I wasn't thinking of that, missy. I was wondering now if you had any little bit of dress as you didn't want. Your clothes is very handsome, and something as you didn't greatly care for would fetch a few pennies if it was sold, and so help on with the tambourine. Maggie's blue eyes began to sparkle. "Why, there's my new hat," she said. "Mother got it for me in London only a week ago, and I know it cost pounds. It has 2 long white feathers. I like it very much, but I could do without it, 'cause I've got my common garden hat to wear. Do you think I could get a few pennies for it? My new best hat with the feathers and the lace, Susie?" "Oh, yes, missy. Oh, yes, missy. I seed the hat yesterday, and I never clapped my 2 eyes on something so beautiful. But it seems a pity to take away from you, missy dear, and maybe the little common garden hat would fetch enough to buy the tambourine." "Oh, I wouldn't said that at all," said Maggie. "I'm very fond of my garden hat, 'cause father likes me in it. And sides, I've gathered strawberries in it, and I've had wild bird eggs in it. I'd much, much rather sell this stupid new hat." Susie was quite agreeable to the transfer, and it was finally agreed that the 2 little girls were to meet each other at the same hour on the following morning, and Susie was to accompany Maggie to the pawnbroker's, where the new hat might be disposed of. If there was a commonplace, ordinary, everyday London child, it was Susie. She was the sister of the 2 little brothers, who also belonged to a very easily found class of human beings. She was the daughter of an industrious, hard-working, everyday mother, and yet she was also sister to Joe. How Joe got into that home was a puzzle to all who knew her. She had innate refinement, and she had heaven-born beauty. Her ideas were above her, and her little flower-like face looked like some rare exotic among its ruder companions. Mrs. Elmore alone knew why Joe was different from her other children. Joe represented a short, bright episode in the hard-working woman's life. She had been born in good days, in sweet, happy country days. Her father had been like her, refined in features and poetic in temperament. Shortly after Joe's birth, the Almars had come to London poverty and all its attendant ills had overtaken them, and after a few years Almar had fallen a victim to consumption, and had left his wife with 4 young children on her hands, the 3 youngest of whom altogether resembled her. Mrs. Almar had no time to grieve. She was a brave woman. There are many brave women in the world, thank God. Among the working poor, they are perhaps more the rule than the exception. She turned round, faced her position, and managed after a fashion to provide for her children. Many visitors came to see her, for she was eminently respectable, and had an honest way about her which impressed people, and all these visitors pitied her when they saw Joe. Poor little Joe was a cripple, a lovely cripple, but still unable to walk or move from her little sofa. The visitors congratulated Mrs. Almar on her strong boys and stalwart-looking little daughter, but they invariably pitied her about Joe. Nothing made that worthy woman so angry. "For Joe is my brightest blessing," she would exclaim. "She's always like a bit of sunshine in the room. Trouble bless her! She a trouble? Why, don't she take the trouble off my shoulders more than anyone else ever did or ever will do. Ask me who never yet spoke a cross word, and I'll tell you it's that little pale girl who can never lift herself off the sofa. Ask me who keeps the peace with the others, and I'll tell you again it's little Joe. And she don't preach, not she, for she don't know how, and she never looks reproachful for all the roughness and the wildness of the others, but her life's one sermon, and in short, we none of us could get on without her. Joe my trouble indeed. I only wish them visitors would talk about what they knows nothing on. When Mrs. Almar felt for her little lame daughter was also, although perhaps in a slightly minor degree, acknowledged by the boys and Susie, they clung to Jo and looked up to her. The boys, who were the two youngest of the family, had a habit of giving her their absolute confidence, and they not only told her of their good deeds but of their naughty ones. They had a habit of pouring out their little scraps of misdemeanors with one of Jo's thin hands clasped to her tearful face. And when she forgave and when she encouraged, the sunshine came out again on them. But Susie was different from the boys, and of late she had kept the knowledge of more than one naughty little action from Jo. The history of the tambourine, the history of the purchase of that redoubtable instrument, which was to make Susie's fortune and fill the Almars' house with not only the necessities but also some of the dainties of life, was of course known by Jo. No one had ever been more interested in the purchase of a musical instrument than she was in the collecting of that hoard, which was to result in the buying of Susie's tambourine. Jo was a delightful and sympathizing listener, and Susie liked nothing better than to kneel by her sofa and pour out her longings and dreams into so good a listener's ear. But Susie had kept more than one secret to herself, and she said nothing to Jo about her interview with little Miss Ascot, nor about the arrangement she had made with that little lady to purchase the tambourine out of the proceeds of the sale of her best hat. Susie knew perfectly that Jo would not approve of anything so underhanded, and she resolved to keep her own counsel. She returned home, however, in the wildest spirits, and indulged all day long in fantastic daydreams. Jo was having a bad day of much pain and suffering, but Susie's brightness was infectious, and Mrs. Almar thought, as she tidied up her place, made it straight, that surely there never were happier children than hers. "But we won't have the tambourine for many and many a day yet," said Ben. "Don't be too sure, Susie. How can you tell but the Master Ralph's got tired of saving up all his pennies for you?" "Anyhow," continued Ben, with a profound sigh, "we has a sight of days to wait afore we gets after a crown." "I knows what I knows," answered Susie. "Look here, Jo, you're the one for making up real pictures. I wants to make a daydream, and you tell me what to do with it when we get it. S'posen now, oh, do be quiet, Ben and Bob. S'posen now I'd the tambourine, and it wore a beauty. Well, suppose as the day is fine, and the hair balmy, and everybody goes out, so to speak, with their pockets open, and they sees me, and I'm dressed up smart and tidy. Oh my, and ain't you a red about the face just?" Here interrupted Bob. "Well, don't interrupt. I can't help my complexion. I'm tidy enough, and I'm dancing round, and I'm playing the tambourine like anything, and I'm singing. Well, maybe it's Nellie Bly, or maybe it's Susie. The crowd collects and laughs, and they likes it, and then the ladies and gents, they go by, so they give me their pennies, lots of 'em. One old gent, he have no change, and he throws me a shillin'. Well, now, that's my daydream. I comes home, and I gives the pennies to mother, and I keeps the shilling. I keeps the shilling for a treat for us 4 young'uns. Now, Jo, speak up. What shall we do with our daydream?" The boys were very wildly excited. To all intents and purposes, the shilling was already in Susie's possession. Bob, to relieve his overcharged feelings, instantly stood on his head, and Ben set to work to punch him. Jo's eyes began to shine. "'Tis a real beautiful daydream, Susie darlin'," she said. "Yes, ain't it, Joe? A whole shilling, you mind. Now make up what we'll do with it. Let's all sit quiet and shut our eyes and listen to Joe. You'll be sure to make up something uncommon, Joe dear." Joe, when she spoke, or at least when she made up what her brothers and sisters call daydreams, always clasped her hands and gazed straight before her. Her large violet-tinted eyes began to see visions, now here to be perceived without that commonplace, whitewashed room. The children who listened to her instinctively perceived this, and they usually closed their own eyes in order to follow her glowing words the better. On this occasion she spoke slowly, and after a pause. "A whole shilling," she began. "It's a sight of money, and it ought to do a deal. What I'm thinking is this. Suppose we had a wan as would hold us all. Mother and Susie and Ben and Bob, and there was lots of green grass in the bottom of the wan. So we all of us sat easy and had no pain even when it moved. Suppose there were 2 horses to the wan and a kind driver, and we went very quick. We went away from the house and streets, and we left the noise behind, and the dust and the dirt behind as well, and we got out into the fields with trees a-growin', and real yellow buttercups looking up at you saucy and perky like, and dear little white daisies like bits of snow with yellow eyes. Suppose we all got out there, right in the fields, and we seed a little brook running and rushing past us. We see the fishes leaping for joy out of the waters, and if the sun was very hot, we got under a big tree where it was shady, and we sat there, and Mother and I sat side by side, and you, Susie, and you, Ben and Bob, just rolled about on the green and picked the buttercups and the daisies. Why, I can think of nothing better than that, unless maybe angels came and talked to us while we were there." Here Joe paused abruptly, and the little children, who had sat absolutely motionless, opened their eyes. The 2 boys sighed deep, but Susie, after a time, began to cut up daydream, while Joe thought of the angels, the only completion of such a joyful day. It occurred to practical Susie to suggest a good, substantial dinner to be eaten under the shade of the green trees.